Hi, my name's Peter Kelly. I'm Director of the Poverty Alliance, and I've been asked to talk to you today about poverty in Scotland, poverty and inequality in Scotland, and the current situation we're in at the moment in terms of the cost of living crisis. So the impact that the inequality, that rising inflation is having on poverty and inequality in Scotland and having on people living on low incomes in Scotland. Just before I start, I should say that the Poverty Alliance, the organisation I work for, is the National Anti-Poverty Network in Scotland. We represent hundreds of grassroots community organisations, voluntary organisations, and other campaigners, all involved in various aspects of the fight against poverty in Scotland. Our role is to try and influence policy and practice that will bring about real substantial changes in poverty in Scotland. And I'll touch on some of the things that we're calling for and that we think need to be done at the end of this presentation, because for us, poverty, inequality isn't a theoretical issue. It's a very real and tangible problem that many hundreds of thousands of people face in Scotland in their daily lives, and something that is absolutely solvable, something that we absolutely can take action to address right here and now. So I want to start by looking at some of the trends around poverty in Scotland over the last 20 years or so, before we start thinking about the impact of the cost of living crisis at the moment and what that means for poverty and inequality in Scotland. So let me just start by looking at some of these figures. So firstly, this chart here shows child poverty trends since the mid 1990s. And I think it's important when we look at trends in poverty and inequality to consider the long term. And what this graph shows, and the important message, I guess, from this graph is that whilst quite often we think of poverty, of child poverty, as something that's relatively fixed and unchanging in our society, actually it's something that does go through quite significant change over time. So we see here these figures for Scotland where back in the mid 1990s, we had levels of child poverty at around about a third. 32% of children in Scotland were living in low-income households at that time. The definition, the measure of child poverty that we're using here is the 60% of household median incomes after housing costs, which is the important standard measure that we use in Scotland. And what we see here is that right throughout really the period from around 97 onwards through to around about the mid 2000s, we saw child poverty levels starting to fall, quite pronounced at the start of the 2000s, and then leveling off mid 2000s to a period where this grey bar is the Great Recession around about 2008, 2009, where we start to see the levels of child poverty start to increase again. But the key message here is that through a range of interventions in our economy and through social policy means, we're able to drive down levels of child poverty to around about 21% in Scotland. That was a combination of measures that were taken at the UK level and at the Scottish level. So things like the introduction of tax credits, the higher levels of child benefit and other income-related benefits for families with children. The introduction of the national minimum wage in 1999, all of these had the impact of helping to drive down levels of child poverty. We also saw rising labour market participation during this period, particularly in the period up to the recession in 2008. All of those playing a part in helping to drive down poverty. Now, obviously, getting child poverty levels down to 20% is far from what we would call success. But what it does show is that those policies had an impact and were able to have a meaningful impact on levels of poverty at the time. What we've seen since then in Scotland and across the rest of the UK is those levels of child poverty starting to increase again. The figures up to 2020 show a gradual increase in levels of child poverty since that time. Let me quickly move on to one other dimension, and these figures, I guess, show different aspects of child poverty and tell different parts of the story of poverty and inequality in Scotland and the UK. One important dimension in relation to those trends in poverty is around in-work poverty. So this graph shows the proportion of working age adults who were in relative poverty by the household work status. So in households where at least one person was in work. And what we see is a steady increase in that proportion. So overall, the levels of in-work poverty haven't risen dramatically, but what we've seen is that the proportions of adults, sorry, I'll rephrase that, the levels of working age adult poverty would appear not to have increased dramatically, although a steady, very slow increase, I think, over the period. What we do see with this figure is no recognizable improvement. But where there has been real significant change is in that band at the bottom of in-work households and working households. So we've seen working age adults who are in poverty, who are in households where someone's in work, going from around about 48% who were in working households back in the mid-1990s to around about 60%. And what that speaks to is the changes that we've witnessed in our labour market over that time. So the growth in so-called flexible working, atypical working, so many more people working in part-time employment, more people working in other forms of so-called flexible work, so around 0 hours, contract working, so on. These have all had an impact, particularly at the lower end of the labour market, as it's called, at the entry level of labour market. So particular impact in terms of in-work poverty on women, on young workers, and workers from Black and ethnic minority communities, all more likely to experience periods of in-work poverty. But we see here an important trend in terms of how we go about tackling poverty and inequality. Increasingly, our labour market is not the route out of poverty that we once hoped that it would be for many people. So again, we need to consider not when we think about poverty, we need to consider not just those who are not in work. Increasingly, we need to think about those who are in work or in working households. One other dimension that I want to highlight here in terms of trends is around pensioner poverty, because this is, again, telling a really important story about success in our policy measures. So if we've been having this discussion in the 1980s and we've been talking about poverty, we would most likely have been really focused on pensioner poverty. That isn't the case now. We tend not to talk about pensioner poverty to anywhere near the same extent. And that's because we've seen dramatic falls in pensioner poverty from, again, similar to child poverty, around about 30%, over 30% of pensioners living in low-income households in the mid-1990s, down to around about 10% around the time of the Great Recession and into the early parts of the last decade. Again, we're seeing an increase in pensioner poverty, not the significant increases at the moment, or at least not dramatic increases, but I think a very concerning increase in pensioner poverty in recent years. And again, if we think about the things that had an impact on pensioner poverty, we're looking at specific policy interventions. So things like pension credit, when it was first introduced, they gave a boost to low-income pensioners. More recently, the triple lock on pensions has managed to ensure that pensions haven't declined in value to the same extent as other social security benefits. So those are important measures that have that have meant that more pensioners have been able to move out of poverty. And of course, there's also been important demographic changes that are maybe not going to have the same impact in the future. So things like more pensioners retiring in the early 2000s who had mortgages, who weren't paying rent, so their incomes were more secure and higher because of that. More pensioners who were retiring who had access to private pensions. These are trends that may not be replicated into the future. So really important that we consider the future of pensioners when we're thinking about how we address poverty and inequality in the long term. One final graph that I want to show you before talking about the cost of living crisis is this is just to break down the different family types when we think about child poverty. It's important for us to understand and to take an intersectional view of poverty and inequality, that when we said that a quarter of children in Scotland are living on low incomes, some children are at greater risk of poverty than others, so that risk isn't shared out equally. So if there's a disabled person, a disabled member of a household, or a disabled child or a disabled adult in a household, the risk of poverty goes up. For the general population, the risk of poverty related to disability is even higher than that 29% that you see there. For larger families, the risk of poverty goes up. Again, you can see the different household types there. Lone parents are still at the greatest risk of poverty alongside minority ethnic households. And again, that figure of 38% will vary depending on different the particular minority ethnic households that we're looking at. So it's important to understand the impact of inequalities across patterns of poverty that we've just been looking at. It's not quite as simple as those graphs might suggest of falls and increases. That experience for different groups can be very different over time. What I want to do now is look at the rising cost of living and what that means for many of the people that the Poverty Alliance is working with. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, inflation is at a 40-year high at the moment. Reached just over 10% last month in September, and possibly increasing to 14% by the middle of next year. That has really significant implications rather for people living on low incomes. When we start to break that inflation rate down, we see how it impacts on people on lower incomes in different ways. So people who already live on low incomes tend to spend more of their income on basic items like food, and therefore the increase in food inflation over the last year is really telling when we consider the impact on low-income households. So the Office for National Statistics produced some new research in the last few weeks, which looked at the inflation rate for so-called budget items, essential items really that most families would rely on and need when putting together their budget for food. So overall, those budget items rose by 17%, but I've given an illustration there of some of the key items in that budget. So milk, bread, and pasta, which rose by 29, 38, and 60% respectively. Those are massive increases and has a significant impact on people who are already just getting by, whose budgets are already significantly stretched. I mentioned in work poverty earlier. One of the big impacts of rising inflation is on real wages. So the Trade Union Congress has estimated that real wages are expected to fall by more than 6% over the next 2 years. And it's important to remember that comes after a decade of stagnation in real wages, where for many years real wages were actually falling, and certainly not rising, but overall across the last decade, stagnating. So people have gone into this cost of living crisis and now what looks like another recession with incomes already depleted, where for many workers their incomes had not recovered since the Great Recession. They were far behind where they might have expected to be at this point. Obviously, energy has been a key driver of rising inflation. Much has been made of the fact that the energy package that was introduced by the short-lived Liz Truss government capped energy prices. But it's important to remember that that cap in energy prices had already increased by 54% up to March, and the cap that was made, the average of £2,500 per household, still represented a 25% cap. And we know now, of course, that under the new government that cap will end in April next year, which could see prices for the average household increase to up to around £4,000 next year, entirely unaffordable for families who are already living on low incomes. Social security benefits are a really vital weapon in protecting people against poverty. But what we've seen in the last year is that weapon being not used, and in fact weakened. So universal credit was cut by £20. It was increased during the pandemic by £20, and that was taken away in October last year. Social security benefits, most means-tested benefits, increased by only 3% in April this year, which, according to the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, meant an additional 600,000 people in the UK being pulled into poverty because of that increase being pegged at 3.1% instead of around about 6 or 7%, as was the rate of inflation at the time. And it's not just about what's happening to people's incomes, it's their savings as well. So Step Change, the debt charity, reported that over 3 million people earlier on in this crisis were already using credit cards to pay for essentials, so therefore storing up more problems in relation to unaffordable debt for the future. And we know that during the pandemic, people on higher incomes were able to save because of changes in patterns in spending during the pandemic. But for people on the lowest incomes, savings actually fell. So people were less likely to be furloughed, more likely to have lost employment during the pandemic, and so they did see their savings fall where savings did exist. So people going into this cost of living crisis really in a perilous state. And what we've been doing as a network of anti-poverty organisations is trying to understand what the impact of this of rising costs has been. So not unexpectedly, we're expecting to see increases in the numbers of people who are experiencing absolute poverty or deprivation. So that's going without one of life's essentials. So whether that's being able to pay your rent or have sustainable accommodation, pay for food, or heat your home, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation expects the numbers in deprivation to increase. They've already increased up to 2017. They expect those numbers to increase again as a result of the cost of living crisis. And whilst we often talk about the effects of the cost of living crisis or the changes in poverty in terms of incomes and in terms of the material impacts, what we know that there is a significant impact on mental health and well-being and on health more generally due to the rising cost of living. And it's certainly one of the things that members of the Poverty Alliance report back to us increasingly is about the stress and the fear that people experience due to the rising cost of living, about how they're going to make ends meet, how they're going to pay those essential bills, how they're going to heat their homes, and how they're going to feed their families. These are absolute urgent questions that people are facing now. And service providers who work with the Poverty Alliance are seeing significant increases in demand for their services, for advice services, but even those who are providing advice are seeing calls on them for emergency support, practical emergency support in terms of food, in terms of payments towards energy, to pay for energy rather. Organisations like the Trussell Trust, which is the largest network of food banks, have seen a significant increase in calls for their support. And worryingly, the main food bank networks in Scotland are also reporting that more people who are in employment are using their services. So really concerning changes taking place. And all of this is creating additional impacts on those organisations who are providing support. So in terms of their own staff well-being and an inability of those organisations to provide help. So addressing some of these issues, I think for the UK government, we need to see an early commitment to increase benefits by inflation. So the way that benefits are increased every year, or at least when they are increased, is in relation to inflation, the rate of inflation in September of the previous year. Now that was 10.1%, so we would hope to see the government commit to increasing social security benefits in April next year by at least 10%. This is the single biggest action that the UK government can take to address poverty during the cost of living crisis. If they don't do that, then it will take hundreds of pounds out of the average benefit recipients' income and leave them even worse off than they are already. I think we need to see an early commitment to a new approach to capping energy prices. We know that the current approach will end in April, so we need to see this government coming forward with measures that will effectively target those who are on low incomes, who are spending a greater proportion of their income on energy, to make sure that they can get through the next year, because this cost of living crisis will continue. I think we need to look at wealth taxes in the mix of the measures that the UK government could take forward to not only pay for some of the measures that are required, but also start to bring about a greater element of fairness and equality into our system of taxation. So the fact that we've preserved the higher rate of income tax and we've introduced windfall tax, those are important measures, but I think we need to look at longer term approaches to addressing inequalities in wealth as part of the mix to addressing poverty overall. Scotland obviously has powers to address poverty as well, so we need to see them make greater use of the social security powers that exist here. They've introduced the Scottish child payment over the last 2 years, which has been really important, and we've seen that progressively increase well above inflation. We need to see that to continue, so it's at £25 per child, per eligible child at the moment. That's any children whose families are receiving benefits already can access the Scottish child payment, but we need to see that increase. We think there's more that can be done there. We want to see additional payments made through the council tax reduction scheme and a doubling of the Scottish Child Winter Heating Assistance Package. The Scottish Welfare Fund is an emergency fund the Scottish Government introduced several years ago that can make crisis payments to people who need it. Many more people are going to need to call on the Scottish Welfare Fund, so we need to see an increase of 50% in the amount that's available to the Scottish Welfare Fund. That's only another £17 million going into the Scottish Welfare Fund. We also need to see at least commitments to current levels of investment in energy efficiency programmes in Scotland. There has been some threat over those, as there has been to employability schemes that help support people back into the labour market. It's really important that even in a tight labour market that we have at the moment, where there's high levels of employment and low levels of unemployment, that we still invest in labour market programmes to help people who may be facing challenges joining the labour market to be able to do so. And finally, what we can do, I think we need to ensure, and I'm speaking here, I guess, about members of the Poverty Alliance, so grassroots organisations, voluntary sector organisations. We need to ensure that welfare rights, so the advice and support for people to access social security, is there. That kind of advice can be really impactful and really help people who are facing tough times. We need more help from energy companies, so we need to see a reduction in the number of people who are being put onto prepayment meters. We need better support from energy companies' helplines. We also need to see the Scottish Government do more around programmes like Fair Work First that makes the real living wage a much more central part of the support that employers receive from government. And we need to ensure that whatever emergency support is provided to people, that it's done in a dignified and respectful way. So there's been a lot of talk about the introduction of warm banks. I think there's clearly a need to find practical support for people who are facing difficulties this winter, but I think it's really important that that's done in dignified and respectful ways, and that we keep a focus on providing people with cash entitlements to allow them to lead, to make their own choices and to lead a dignified life. I hope this short talk has been useful for you and giving you an idea about some of the drivers of poverty in Scotland, and about particularly some of the really serious issues that we face at the moment in terms of the cost of living crisis. Thank you very much.